Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. We're working on block number 8 and I have many beautiful designs to share with you. So let's jump on the block and get started free motion quilting our square in a sun block. So I'm getting started quilting right in the center of the block and along the marked lines for our center sun motif. And so this is just careful slow stitching to stitch all the way around that center starting circle. And then let's say this was imperfect and you didn't like it and maybe it was just driving you crazy and you're really wanting to stop and rip it out. Well, you can fix it by swinging inside and stitching a spiral or any other design that you like. You know, we've learned lots of designs this year. So if there was another design like sharp stippling or zippling or pebbling, we're going to do a lot of pebbling today. But you could fill any of those designs into the center area and kind of hide your mistakes. And it really works well because you add texture to it, you throw a little bit more thread at it, and it's like, I don't know why, but it just seems that it stops you from really nitpicking the design. So even though my circle wasn't exactly perfect, it looks great now. So now the second step of the sun is to stitch along those wiggly flame shapes. So I'm just stitching out, and I've noticed I've got some seam allowances right here. I'm going to lift my presser foot just a bit as I near that area and then bounce off of it and stitch back. And this is just a special feature of this particular darning foot. It has a spring on it, and I can raise the height of the foot just a little bit, and that's just a special feature of that particular foot. If you had that issue and you did not have this type of foot, couple other options would be simply to not stitch all the way to the tip of the flame. You don't have to stitch all the way to the end. You could just back off a little bit and that would work too. If you start feeling resistance on your presser foot and you can't move the quilt, it's a good idea to just back out of the design and then consistently repeat that same path on all of them. So like in this case, it gets a little bit tense right at that spot. Just back off a bit and it'll still look great. So I'm just going to continue quilting around all of these flame shapes, and then I'm going to change thread colors to white, and we're going to fill in these triangles next. So we're working into the orange sections, and I've taken a second to stitch in the ditch around my center square and around the orange square. So that's already been ditched, and now I'm forming beautiful circular shapes, the design called Pebble Aang, into this area. So when it comes to pebbling, your focus is just forming circular shapes and kind of fitting it into the space. I really like it when I have kind of the 3 edges to stitch around so that I can swing out and around and I know roughly how big that shape's going to have to be. It takes practice to get this though and be able to see how to fit them together just exactly right. And you will have to cut them off, just like I just did. I just used a subtle arch shape to pretend there was a whole circle there, and that's perfectly fine too. The one thing you want to try and avoid is getting too many small circles. That's where things can really start to get dense and lock up your quilt. It's going to feel kind of stiff, and then it's also going to take forever to quilt it. So watch out for that. Try and make your circles as big as possible. But if you have to stitch some small ones, like here I'm having to fit some small ones into that little gap, that's okay too. Just try as soon as you have a bigger space to swing out with a bigger size circle, and that's going to work out great. So of course you can definitely use your marking guide to mark this, but you can also see that pebbling is easy enough to stitch freehand. And so I encourage you to give this a try. Maybe stitch some of these triangles with the design marked, and then some of them completely freehand where it's not marked at all. So you can see I have this pathway. I started over here and I stitched my pebbling through that area, and then now I'm escaping from this triangle in this corner and going straight into the next corner, and that really is going to work out great. So definitely give this one a try. So this month I'm trying something different again with marking. This time I'm playing with freezer paper. So I took the pages of our marking diagram in the pattern and I printed it out onto freezer paper. You can see there's a waxy side and a paper side. I printed the diagram onto the paper side and then cut out and I have pressed triangles into these areas. Now, you don't have to do this. Obviously, straight lines could be marked with simply a ruler, but I just wanted to show you that this is a different method of marking that does work and can be used to mark your quilts from the surface. This is something that we started learning about last month when I shared an extra tip in last month's block about marking with golden threads paper. And a lot of people asked, a lot of quilters asked, well, what about having something that could actually go through a printer, that could actually be printed on directly, because it does take a lot of time to transfer the marks to paper and hand draw everything out. And so I decided to give this a try, and I will say one problem that I ran into almost immediately was I had trouble getting the freezer paper to adhere. And then I also had to watch out for the size of my iron. My regular iron would have heat set the marks here in the sun while I was pressing this area. So I ended up using a small craft iron in order to secure this. And it did take a little while to get it to stick and get it placed properly. But it did work out. And I did cut the shapes a little smaller, you can see, than the space. And that way I can see my ditches and get a lot more accurate placement and not stitch out of the ditch as I go around these areas. So I do think it works, and I think it has an interesting application here. Certainly you can quilt over it. As you can see, I'm stitching with my walking foot here. And I have lowered my stitch length to 1.4 millimeters. It's a little smaller than I usually quilt with, simply because I know I need to be able to tear this paper away later. So I definitely think that a small stitch length is important here. If you're free motion quilting, just try and keep your stitches a little smaller than usual. And I think that that's going to work out great. So I'm just stitching on these lines, and you can see the path is basically just stitch through one area and then travel stitch in the ditch and knock out all the lines one by one. And I just ended up travel stitching right through the ditch to get to the next set of triangles, and that worked out really well. So I'm going to hit this last triangle, and then let's try and remove the paper and just see how easy or how challenging that is using freezer paper. So here's an area I already stitched, and I'm just using basically the end of my machine brush to kind of press on the stitches while I pull on the freezer paper. And I can already say this is not as easy to pull apart as the golden threads paper. Usually if you pull the quilt kind of on the diagonal a little bit, the threads would already start to pop through, and that's not really happening. But I think the key to this will be working kind of one edge at a time. So once you get like the little triangles kind of cut out, then you can move on to these larger areas, and I'm just ripping right along the stitching. And the only thing that I think would be a problem here is just ripping the paper away, putting stress on the stitching and making that go kind of loosey-goosey. But it's looking okay. Maybe one or two stitches might be getting a little pulled out a bit, and then I think that that will end up sorting itself out whenever you wash the quilt, whenever it's soaked, whenever you remove all the rest of the markings. So I don't think it's the end of the world. It's got some upsides and got some downsides, just like the golden threads paper. The upside was it was easy to stitch and see through, and it was easy to tear away, but the downside was it took a lot of time to sit there and hand mark the surface and then place it on the quilt. Was a little tricky with ditches. With this, I think obviously it's so easy to just print the design directly onto the freezer paper, but the downside is it's a little bit more difficult to get it placed and actually press it in place. That seemed a little challenging, and then obviously ripping it away here is going to take some time. And I'm not going to be super nitpicky with this. If I end up with like little bits of paper left in here, I'm just going to trust that washing the quilt is going to pull that out. And I'm not going to sit here with a seam ripper or a needle and poke at it all day. So that got it ripped through, and I'm pretty pleased with my stitches. I see I've got just a few kind of loops. It almost looks like a loop when the freezer paper pulled just a little bit too hard. But again, I think that will sort itself out as the quilt gets washed and used. So from here, I've taken out all of the freezer paper and finished quilting all of those straight lines. And then I changed to orange thread and stitched in the ditch around those cream triangles, around those flying geese. And then I connected to my ditches between the center block and the borders, and I stitched that area in the ditch too. And so now I'm quilting into these areas, filling them in with hot path. So this is an edge to center design, which means I'm going to kind of wiggle into the center, come to a point, and then wiggle back. I'm going to hit that ditch and then wiggle back into the center. This is a great sashing design. It's really wiggly. It has a really nice flame-like texture, and it fills really, really quickly. You're always going to be moving down the length of your quilt, and as you can see, it's just bouncing against the ditches and then bouncing into the middle of the quilting space. So one thing you might be wondering is, well, what happens if you overshoot it a little bit? What happens if you go past the middle of your quilting space? And that's fine. I think it makes it more interesting. Try not to overshoot your ditches though, but even if you do, I would leave it in. Don't bother ripping something out when you could probably just, I don't know, stitch it over a few times and it would probably look just fine. I really like this flame-like texture, and it really goes along nicely with the flames that we stitch in the outer border of the quilt. And I've already knocked out just a little bit of that as I was traveling around the edges of the quilt. So here I'm going to fill in with just a few tiny flame shapes, and you could hear my needle hitting. There's a lot of seam allowances right there, so you have to be kind of careful. So I'm going to travel stitch down, just right in the ditch, and then now I'm going to form the opposite side. So I'm going to wiggle in and form a hot path shape in between the flames before. So travel stitch down, and now I should be able to knock these out bouncing in the ditch instead of having to travel stitch, and that makes it much faster. So I just wiggle in. It's almost like an echo. That's kind of the way I think of it whenever I work my way in between the flame shapes. I'm kind of echoing them. And then I work my way back out again, bounce against the ditch, and pop back up again. So really, this design has two possible variations. You could quilt just one half of it through, let's say, the sashing or border of a quilt. That would be just fine. That would be probably more than enough quilting than you would need. Or you could quilt both halves of it. You could also go inside of these flame shapes and do all kinds of funky stuff, you know, fill them in with echoes or anything you like. It's really a creative design. So let's also knock out some of our border design. This is just our wiggly flame shapes, just more of that, basically the same shape that we were just stitching. And I have just marked dots here in my border so that way I can bounce from dot to dot, just a wiggly line down and a wiggly line back up. And it might not look exactly like the diagram, but it's close enough and it fills in the space, and it's just a little bit, less symmetrical, and I like that about it. I like being able to form things freehand so I don't have to mark them. It doesn't take as much time. So now that I'm in this area, I wanted to fill in this triangle with Pebble Aang. But here's something that happened in this corner. I ended up stitching my pebbles so messy. I just could not travel stitch for some reason, having a bad day. And they came out so messy, I decided, hey, you know what, let's change that up and let's turn it into a design called Underwater Rocks. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this corner. So this is what happens when you totally mess up your pebbling and you can't travel stitch. While you just add more layers of thread, go back and make messy echoes. I really like that term. Nice and messy echoes around and around. And I'd say 3 times around each circle is probably plenty. So sometimes I'll slow down just a bit when I'm getting close to a ditch, but for the most part, this design is very, very fast. So watch your speed. If your stitches start getting really big, make sure to slow down your hands a little bit. You're probably pretty comfortable with the design. So I like to really speed up and really loop it around and get super, super messy here, and that's okay. That's the nice thing about it, is Underwater Rocks is basically the more forgiving version of pebbling that allows you to get away with being messy and not being able to travel stitch perfectly, but you still end up with a really cute design. And the thing I love most about it is that your pebbles end up standing out that much better. You can really see them on the surface of the quilt. You can really appreciate them. And then the texture, I think, just really adds to the design. So definitely give this a try. If you're feeling like circles are just not your thing and you're really frustrated with it, then underwater rocks may very well be the thing that helps you get the hang of circles, but without that kind of constant seeking of perfection, without having to feel like it's got to be just exactly right. So I'm going to finish filling in this area with more underwater rocks or Pebble Aang, whichever one, and filling in the border with more flame shapes. So that's it for block number 8. If you're looking for the pattern, you can click right here to find it at leahday.com. Make sure to post any questions that you have in the comments below, and I'll be sure to help you out. Until next time, let's go quilt.